My name is Angelica. I am 23 years old, and I bought myself. Not with prayers, not with luck. With blood, sweat, and 13 years of hiding copper coins in wet Georgia soil, while the world told me I was nothing but property. I want you to understand something before I tell you how it happened. The morning I walked back through the iron gates of the Whitmore plantation, paper in hand, I wasn't nervous. I wasn't shaking. I was the calmest I had ever been in my life, because I had already done the impossible. And the man who once owned me hadn't slept a full night in years. He just didn't know I was the reason why. And before I go any further, if a story like this touches something deep inside you, if you believe that a woman's word should be worth more than any man's piece of paper, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Leave a comment telling me where you're from, because I want to know who is out there listening. Every comment, every like, it helps my family keep bringing these stories to you. It puts food on our table. And trust me, what I'm about to tell you next is the part that changed everything. There is a part of this story that still keeps me awake at night, not from shame, but from the weight of what I know. What I found when I returned to that house was something I had never prepared for. Something that changed the meaning of everything I had sacrificed. Before I tell you that part, I need you to know where I came from, because the ending only makes sense when you understand just how far down they tried to bury me, and how deep a woman must dig when the whole world has decided she doesn't exist. Georgia, in 1849, smelled like red clay after rain and something older, something rotting underneath the sweetness of magnolia blossoms. The Whitmore plantation sat on 40 acres of land that the Colonel called his blessing from God. I called it something else. The big house had white columns that caught the morning light like teeth, and the fields behind it stretched so far you couldn't see where the cotton ended and the pale sky began. We lived in wooden cabins that leaked cold air through the walls in January and trapped heat like an oven in July. The dirt floor was always damp. At night, you could hear the frogs singing from the creek, and if you closed your eyes tight enough for just 1 second, you could almost forget where you were. My days began before the sun did. I was 10 years old and already assigned to the big house, scrubbing floors, hauling water from the well, polishing boots that would never be mine to wear. My hands were cracked and raw before most children my age had finished their breakfast. I had no last name. On the Colonel's ledger, I was listed simply as girl, field capable, good health, valued at $240. That was my entire existence reduced to ink on paper. But even then, even at 10 years old, moving invisible through those perfumed hallways, I was watching, memorizing, counting every single thing they thought I was too simple to understand. The wound I carried wasn't just hunger or exhaustion. Those I had learned to fold up small and tuck away. The real pain was my mother. She worked the fields from sunrise to dark, and some nights she was so tired she couldn't lift her arms to hold me. But she always found a way to press her forehead against mine and whisper, "Your name means angel, baby. Don't you ever let them take that from you." She said it like a prayer, like armor. I didn't fully understand it then, but the morning Colonel Pasquale's overseer raised his whip over her back for moving too slowly through the cotton rows, and I stood there, frozen, too small and too terrified to do a single thing. I understood that I would spend the rest of my life making sure no one ever made me feel that powerless again. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late October, when the air was finally beginning to cool and the magnolias had gone quiet. I was scrubbing the front veranda on my hands and knees, the wet brush moving in circles across the pale wooden planks, when Caleb Whitmore walked out through the front door. He was 16, the Colonel's only son, tall and soft in the way that boys are when they have never gone hungry a single day in their lives. He stopped right beside me, close enough that I could smell the breakfast still on his breath, and said something cruel about the way I was scrubbing. Without thinking, without planning, I sat back on my heels, looked straight up into his eyes, and told him plainly, "One day, I will come back here as a free woman, and you will know my name." The words came out of me like they had always been there, just waiting for a door to open. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Caleb stared at me like I had struck him across the face. His expression moved through surprise, then confusion, then something uglier. The particular fury of a boy who has never been spoken to as an equal and does not know what to do with it. I did not look away. That was the part that sealed my fate. A slave girl who spoke out of turn could be beaten and forgiven. A slave girl who held eye contact while doing it was something the colonel could not allow to stand unpunished inside his own house. By nightfall, word had reached the colonel. By morning, the decision had already been made. I was to be sold south immediately, before my defiance spread like a sickness through the other cabins. They took me 3 days later. No warning, no ceremony. Just a man with rope and a wagon that smelled of pine resin and fear. My mother ran after the wagon barefoot through the red dirt road, screaming my name until her voice broke into something that didn't sound human anymore. I didn't cry. I pressed my back against the wooden boards and watched her figure grow smaller and smaller until the road curved and she disappeared completely. I had one thought, sharp and cold as a blade. I will come back. Not as a wish, not as a prayer, as a contract I was making with myself, the only contract in the state of Georgia that no white man's signature could nullify. Beside me on the wagon floor, a thin striped cat had leaped up from nowhere and curled against my leg. I didn't push him away. Alabama hit me like a fist. The plantation they sold me to belonged to a man named Hargrove, a name I still taste like iron when I say it. His fields were wider than anything I had seen in Georgia, and the overseer, a red-faced man they called Dutch, had a reputation that traveled ahead of him like a bad smell. The first week, I made the mistake of finishing my cotton quota before sundown. Instead of rest, Dutch assigned me double rows for the following morning. I learned fast. In Hargrove's world, efficiency was not rewarded. It was punished. They didn't want workers who were capable. They wanted workers who were broken. I filed that lesson away carefully, the way you file a sharp thing, blade inward, handle out, ready for when you truly need it. At night, when the cabin was dark and the other women were finally still, I would lie on my back and stare at the ceiling boards and think about what I had said to Caleb Whitmore. Some nights it felt like the bravest thing any human being had ever done. Other nights it felt like the stupidest. I was 11 years old, in Alabama, owned by a man who did not know my name and did not care to learn it. The cotton fields had a way of making the future feel like a joke, something only free people were allowed to believe in. But then Tenorio would pad across the dirt floor and settle on my chest, his purring vibrating against my ribs like a small, stubborn engine, and something in me would hold. If this scraggly, half-starved cat could survive the auction wagon, the strange hands, the strange fields, then so could I. The second year brought something I had not anticipated. Another woman's cruelty. Her name was Hattie, and she had been at Hargrove's plantation for over a decade. She had learned to survive by making herself useful to the overseer, reporting whispers, naming names, collecting small favors like a woman collecting stones against a flood. When she discovered I was hiding coins, copper pennies earned from mending clothes after dark for the cook's household. She went straight to Dutch. They searched my sleeping mat, my apron, my shoes. They found nothing, because the coins weren't there. They were buried 12 inches deep beneath the roots of a jackfruit tree at the edge of the property, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth I had stolen from the kitchen. Hattie watched my face for signs of defeat. I gave her nothing but silence and kept my eyes forward. Then the fever came. The summer of my 14th year turned the Alabama lowlands into something close to hell. Thick, suffocating heat that pressed down on the cabins like a wet blanket. A sickness moved through the quarters and took 3 people in 2 weeks. I was burning by the 3rd day, shaking so hard my teeth rattled against each other. Hargrove's response was to send the plantation doctor to examine only those workers he considered most valuable. I was not on that list. An older woman named Cora pressed cold rags to my forehead through the night and fed me bitter root tea that tasted like mud and something sharper. By the 5th morning, the fever broke. Cora sat beside me in the early gray light and said quietly, "The ones the Lord means to finish something, He don't let go that easy." I held on to those words like coins. By my 16th year, something in me had gone very quiet. Not broken, but compressed, the way coal compresses into something harder than itself. I had learned to be invisible in plain sight. I worked, I mended, I carried water, and every single night, without exception, I added to what was buried under that tree. A copper penny here, a small coin earned from washing an overseer's wife's linens there. Progress was so slow it was almost insulting. Some months I added only 3 or 4 coins. I calculated, in the dark, that at this pace it would take me decades. And then one night, I heard 2 free black men talking quietly outside the fence, traveling tradesmen passing through, and one of them said something that stopped my blood cold. He said there was a way, a legal way, and it had a name. The word they used was manumission, the legal process by which an enslaved person could purchase their own freedom, if they could gather enough money to meet their owner's price, if they could find a free person to act as guarantor, and if the state approved the paperwork. It was designed to be impossible. The price Hargrove had placed on me, I later learned through careful and dangerous listening, was $480. Exactly double what Colonel Pasquale had sold me for. As if Alabama had looked at me and decided I had become twice the problem. I lay awake that entire night doing mathematics in my head, counting what I had buried, calculating what I still needed, measuring the distance between where I was and where I needed to be in years and sweat and hunger. The number was terrifying, but for the first time, it was a number, not a wall. Everything I had lived through suddenly arranged itself into a shape I could understand. The coins hidden in the earth, Cora's bitter root tea that kept me alive when Hargrove's doctor wouldn't come, Tenorio surviving the auction wagon, my mother's voice pressing my name into me like a brand. Angel, baby, don't let them take it. Even Hattie's betrayal had served me. It had forced me to become smarter about concealment, faster about trust, sharper about who I allowed to see anything real in my face. Every cruelty had been, without knowing it, a lesson. Every year of compression had been building pressure toward a single point. I was not a girl who had survived 13 years of slavery. I was a woman who had spent 13 years constructing the precise instrument of her own liberation. One copper coin, one careful breath, one sleepless night at a time. The dilemma arrived in the winter of my 22nd year, cold and unforgiving as the Alabama ground. I finally had enough. $480 wrapped in oilcloth, buried beneath roots that had grown around my secret like fingers. But Cora was sick, genuinely, deeply sick, and the plantation doctor had already refused her twice. I knew what that refusal meant. I had seen it before. There was a traveling medicine man who passed through the county every few months, and his remedies cost money. Real money. The exact kind I had spent 13 years accumulating. I sat with that knowledge for 3 nights straight, Tenorio pressed against my side, both of us very still. I could buy Cora's medicine and begin saving again, losing perhaps 2 more years of my life to Alabama's fields. Or I could let the woman who saved my life die and walk free by spring. I bought the medicine. I want to be honest about what that decision cost me, not just the coins, but the particular violence of watching my own freedom recede back into the future like a shoreline pulling away from a drowning woman. I cried that night, silently, face pressed into the dirt floor so no one would hear. But when Cora's fever broke 4 days later, and she opened her eyes and looked at me with that quiet recognition that passes between people who have saved each other, I understood something I couldn't have learned any other way. Freedom purchased by abandoning the people who kept you alive was not freedom at all. It was just a different kind of slavery. The kind that lives inside your chest and eats you from within. I began saving again the very next morning. 2 more years. I had survived 13. I could survive 2 more. I walked through the iron gates of the Whitmore plantation on a Thursday morning in April, when the Georgia air smelled of red clay and early honeysuckle, and everything I had carried for 13 years compressed itself into a single heartbeat. I was wearing clean shoes, the first pair I had ever owned outright, and inside my coat, folded against my chest like a second heartbeat, was my manumission paper, signed, witnessed, and legally recorded in the county courthouse of Macon County, Alabama. Caleb Whitmore was standing on the veranda when he saw me coming up the road. I watched his face move through confusion, then recognition, then something I had never seen on a white man's face directed at me before. Fear. I did not rush. I walked at exactly the pace of a woman who has nowhere urgent to be because she has already arrived. I climbed those 3 porch steps and held the paper out and said simply, "I told you I would come back. I keep my word." What I had not expected was what Caleb said next. He didn't rage. He didn't call for anyone. He stood very still for a long moment, looking at the paper in my hand, and then he looked at me, really looked, the way people rarely do, and said quietly that his father had died the previous winter, that the plantation was failing, that half the workers had already fled north. And then, in a voice so low I almost didn't catch it, he said he had never forgotten what I told him on that veranda, that he had thought about it for 13 years, that some part of him had been waiting. I felt the ground shift beneath my clean shoes. I had come prepared for his contempt. I had rehearsed patience against his cruelty. I had not prepared a single word for his remorse. The house behind him looked exactly as I remembered it, and absolutely nothing like I remembered it. Small, tired, already becoming a ruin. I have thought about that morning every single day since. Not with anger. Anger is too expensive a thing to carry forever, and I spent enough years paying prices I didn't choose. I think about it because of what it taught me about the nature of freedom. They took my name, my mother, my childhood, and 13 years of my life. But the one thing they could never confiscate, the one thing that no bill of sale, no overseer's whip, no colonel's ledger could ever touch, was my word. I made a promise on my knees on a wooden veranda when I was 10 years old and worth $240 on paper. I kept it. That is the whole story. Not the cotton, not the coins, not even the paper folded against my chest. The real document of my freedom was written the moment I decided that my word existed, and that it would outlast every single person who tried to convince me otherwise. My name is Angelica, and I kept my promise.